They called themselves the HOA cops, patrolling our quiet street, clipboards in hand, ready to pounce on the smallest mistake. But the day they stormed onto my father's property, everything changed. They thought they could intimidate him, just like everyone else. What they did know, my father isn't the type to back down, especially when it comes to protecting his home. What happened next left the entire neighborhood in shock, and the HOA scrambling to cover their tracks. How far would you go to defend your family from power-hungry neighbors? Watch the full story to find out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your one subscribe means the world to us. Before the chaos, our lives in Willow Creek Estates were almost picture-perfect. My father, a retired Army sergeant, had finally found the peace he'd spent decades fighting for. He and my mother moved into the neighborhood for its quiet streets, manicured lawns, and the promise of a safe, friendly community. Every morning, he'd walk the dog along the tree-lined sidewalks, waving to neighbors tending their gardens or washing their cars. He took pride in our home, painting the shutters himself, planting roses along the fence, and keeping the grass trimmed just so. For him, this house wasn't just a place to live. It was a reward for years of sacrifice. Our neighbors seemed friendly enough at first. There was Mrs. Carter, who baked cookies for new residents, and the Johnsons, who hosted summer barbecues. The HOA sent out cheerful newsletters about upcoming events and reminders to keep trash bins out of sight. It all felt harmless, even comforting. My father, ever the rule follower, made sure we never missed a deadline or left a stray weed in the yard. He believed in order, in community, in doing his part. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of something else, something colder. The HOA board, led by a man named Mr. Grayson, had a reputation for being strict. Some called them overzealous. Others whispered about fines for the smallest infractions, a mailbox painted the wrong shade, a garden gnome deemed unsightly, a car parked an inch over the line. My father brushed off the stories, confident that as long as we followed the rules, we'd have nothing to worry about. Still, there were signs that not everyone felt as welcome as we did. One neighbor quietly moved out after a series of escalating letters from the HOA. Another stopped coming to block parties, her smile replaced by a wary glance whenever the board members walked by. My father noticed, but he chalked it up to misunderstandings, until the day a notice appeared on our door. It was a simple piece of paper, but it changed everything. The letter claimed our fence was 2 inches too high, violating a rule buried deep in the HOA handbook. My father measured it himself, certain there was a mistake, but the board insisted, threatening daily fines if we didn't comply. It was the first crack in the perfect image of Willow Creek Estates. That's when the tension began to build. My father, who had always believed in fairness and respect, found himself facing a system that seemed designed to break those very values. The neighborhood that once felt like home started to feel like enemy territory, and as the HOA's demands grew more unreasonable, it became clear this wasn't just about a fence. It was about control, power, and the lengths some people will go to enforce their will. Little did we know the real battle was just beginning, and my father, calm, disciplined, and fiercely protective, was about to show the HOA what happens when you push the wrong person too far. The first notice about the fence was just the beginning. My father, always methodical, measured every inch, double-checked the HOA handbook, and even called the city to confirm the property lines. He was certain he was in the right, but the HOA board, led by Mr. Grayson and his self-appointed enforcers, refused to budge. They sent a second letter, this time with a fine attached, $50 for every day the fence remained out of compliance. The tone was colder, more threatening. It was clear this wasn't about a fence. It was about power. At first, my father tried to reason with them. He wrote polite emails, attended the next HOA meeting, and brought photos and measurements as evidence, but the board barely listened. Mr. Grayson, sitting at the head of the table with his arms crossed, dismissed my father's concerns with a smirk. The other board members nodded along, more interested in maintaining their authority than in hearing the truth. My father left the meeting with a sinking feeling in his chest. For the first time, he realized the rules weren't meant to protect the community. They were weapons, wielded by those who craved control. The fines kept coming. Every morning, another envelope appeared on our doorstep, each one more aggressive than the last. The language shifted from "please comply" to "final warning." The amount owed climbed higher and higher until it was more than a month's mortgage payment. My mother started to worry. She asked if we should just lower the fence, pay the fines, and move on, but my father refused. He'd spent his life standing up to bullies, and he wasn't about to back down now, not in his own home. Then the harassment began. It started small. A board member parked outside our house for hours, watching as my father mowed the lawn. Someone left anonymous notes in our mailbox, accusing us of ruining the neighborhood. The HOA sent a list of new violations. Our trash bins were visible for 5 minutes too long, the grass was a quarter-inch too high, a flower pot was not in harmony with the community aesthetic. Each infraction came with a fine, and each fine came with a threat. My father tried to keep his cool, but the pressure was relentless. He spent hours documenting everything, taking photos, saving letters, recording dates and times. He called the city again, hoping for help, but they told him the HOA had the right to enforce its own rules. The neighbors, once friendly, started to avoid us. Some looked away when we passed, others whispered behind closed doors. The sense of isolation grew heavier with each passing day. One afternoon, my father found a group of HOA board members standing in our yard, measuring the fence themselves. They didn't knock or ask permission, they just marched onto the property, tape measures in hand, scribbling notes and taking photos. My father confronted them, demanding to know what they were doing. Mr. Grayson, smug as ever, told him they were ensuring compliance. My father's hands shook with anger, but he held his ground. He reminded them that this was his property, not theirs. They ignored him, finished their measurements, and left without another word. That night my father barely slept. He paced the living room, replaying the confrontation in his mind. He wondered how far the HOA would go and what they might do next. The next morning, another letter arrived, this one threatening legal action if the fines weren't paid within 7 days. The total was now over $2,000. My father felt trapped. He'd done everything right, followed every rule, and still it wasn't enough. The stress began to take its toll. My mother grew anxious, jumping at every knock on the door. My father became more withdrawn, spending hours researching HOA laws and talking to lawyers. He discovered that the board had a history of targeting certain homeowners, those who questioned their authority or who didn't fit their vision of the perfect neighborhood. He found online forums filled with similar stories, families driven out by endless fines, retirees forced to sell their homes, young couples sued over minor infractions. The pattern was clear. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were using them as a weapon. Determined to fight back, my father started gathering evidence. He took photos of other fences in the neighborhood, some taller, some shorter, none fined. He documented every interaction with the board, every letter, every visit. He reached out to other homeowners who'd been targeted, hoping to build a case. Some were too afraid to speak up, but a few shared their own stories, stories of intimidation, harassment, and retaliation. My father realized he wasn't alone. The HOA's power was built on fear and silence, but the board wasn't done. One evening, as the sun set over Willow Creek Estates, my father heard footsteps outside. He looked out the window and saw 2 board members, clipboard in hand, flashlights scanning our yard. They were taking photos of our car, our porch, even the dog's water bowl. My father stepped outside, his voice calm but firm, and asked what they were doing. They claimed they were documenting violations. My father told them to leave, reminding them that this was private property. They refused, insisting they had the right to inspect any home in the community. The confrontation grew heated. My father stood his ground, refusing to let them bully him. The board members eventually left, but not before warning him that non-compliance would have consequences. My father knew they were trying to scare him, to make him give up, but he was more determined than ever. The next day, the HOA escalated their campaign. They sent a letter to every homeowner in the neighborhood, accusing my father of being uncooperative and disruptive. They claimed he was endangering property values and undermining community harmony. The letter urged neighbors to report any suspicious activity at our house. Overnight, we became pariahs. Neighbors who once waved now crossed the street to avoid us. Children who played in our yard were called home by anxious parents. The sense of isolation was suffocating, but my father refused to be intimidated. He filed a formal complaint with the state HOA Oversight Board, detailing every instance of harassment and abuse. He contacted a local news station, hoping to shine a light on the board's tactics. He even started a petition, gathering signatures from other homeowners who'd been targeted. The board responded with more threats, lawsuits, liens, even foreclosure. But my father stood firm, determined to fight for his home and his rights. As the days passed, the tension reached a boiling point. The board began patrolling the neighborhood in pairs, clipboards at the ready, watching for any sign of non-compliance. They parked outside our house, taking photos and writing notes. My father installed security cameras, documenting every visit, every threat. He knew the board was looking for any excuse to escalate the conflict. Then one afternoon, everything changed. My father returned home to find a group of board members waiting in our driveway. They demanded access to the backyard, claiming they needed to inspect the fence. My father refused, citing his rights as a homeowner. The board members grew aggressive, threatening to call the police. My father, calm but resolute, told them to leave. They refused, insisting they had the authority to enter the property. The standoff lasted for nearly an hour. Neighbors gathered on their porches, watching the drama unfold. The board members shouted, waved their clipboards, and threatened legal action. My father stood his ground, refusing to be bullied. Finally, the board members left, vowing to return with law enforcement. That night, my father sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by letters, photos, and legal documents. He knew the board wouldn't stop. They were determined to break him, to make an example out of him, but he was just as determined to fight back. He'd faced worse in his life, real danger, real threats. He wasn't about to let a group of petty bureaucrats drive him from his home. As the sun rose the next morning, my father made a decision. He would take the fight public. He contacted a local attorney, filed a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment and abuse of power, and reached out to the media. He knew it would be a long, difficult battle, but he was ready. The board, sensing their control slipping, doubled down. They sent more letters, more fines, more threats. They tried to rally the neighborhood against us, spreading rumors and lies. But my father refused to back down. He knew the law was on his side, and he was determined to see justice done. The stage was set for a showdown, one that would test my father's resolve and expose the true nature of the HOA's power. The neighborhood watched, waiting to see who would blink first. And as the tension reached its peak, one question hung in the air. How far would the HOA go to protect their power, and how far would my father go to defend his home? The answer was coming, and it would shake Willow Creek Estates to its core. The day of the final showdown arrived with a heavy, electric tension that seemed to hang over every house in Willow Creek Estates. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the entire neighborhood sensed that something was about to break. For weeks, the HOA board had escalated their campaign against my father, pushing him to the brink with threats, fines, and public shamming. But what they didn't realize was that every attack only made him more determined. He was no longer just fighting for his own home. He was fighting for every neighbor who had ever been bullied into silence. It started early that morning. My father woke to the sound of tires crunching on gravel. He looked out the window and saw 3 cars parked in front of our house: Mr. Grayson's black SUV, the HOA treasurer's sedan, and a police cruiser. The board had finally made good on their threat to involve law enforcement. My mother's hands trembled as she watched from the kitchen, but my father's face was set with a calm, steely resolve. He gathered his evidence, photos, letters, legal documents, and stepped outside to meet them. The board members stood in a tight cluster, clipboards in hand, their faces hard and triumphant. The police officer, young and clearly uncomfortable, explained that the HOA had filed a complaint, claiming my father was obstructing official business and endangering community safety. They demanded immediate access to the backyard to inspect the fence and document further violations. The officer, caught between the board's authority and my father's rights, looked to my father for a response. My father didn't flinch. He calmly explained that the HOA had no legal right to enter private property without a court order. He handed the officer a copy of the state's homeowner protection laws, highlighting the sections that protected residents from exactly this kind of harassment. He showed the officer the stack of evidence he'd collected, proof of selective enforcement, harassment, and retaliation. The officer, realizing the situation was more complicated than he'd been told, stepped aside and radioed for guidance. But Mr. Grayson wasn't about to back down. He raised his voice, accusing my father of undermining the community and inciting rebellion. He waved a stack of violation notices in the air, demanding that the officer arrest my father for non-compliance. The other board members chimed in, their voices rising in a chorus of outrage. Neighbors began to gather on their lawns, drawn by the commotion. Some watched with concern, others with barely concealed satisfaction. The entire street became a stage, and my father stood at the center, refusing to be intimidated. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, my father pulled out his phone and began live-streaming the confrontation. He spoke directly to the camera, explaining the months of harassment, the endless fines, the threats, and the intimidation. He showed the letters, the photos, the evidence of selective enforcement. He called out the board by name, detailing their abuse of power for the world to see. Within minutes, dozens of neighbors were watching the stream from their phones. Some began to murmur, realizing for the first time just how far the board had gone. The police officer, now aware that the situation was being broadcast live, became even more cautious. He radioed his supervisor, explaining that the dispute was a civil matter and that the HOA had no authority to force entry without a court order. Mr. Grayson's face turned red with anger. He threatened to sue my father for defamation, to have him evicted, to make an example out of him. But the tide was turning. The neighbors, emboldened by my father's courage, began to speak up. One by one, they stepped forward, sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The board's power, built on fear and silence, began to crumble. But the real turning point came when my father revealed his final card. He handed the police officer a thick folder, his lawsuit against the HOA, complete with affidavits from other homeowners, evidence of financial misconduct, and a formal complaint to the state attorney general. He explained that the board had not only violated their own bylaws, but had also broken state and federal laws protecting homeowners from harassment and discrimination. The officer, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, told the board that any further action would have to go through the courts. Mr. Grayson, realizing he had lost control, tried to rally the board members, but their confidence was gone. The treasurer, pale and shaken, stepped back. The secretary, who had always seemed so sure of herself, looked away. The neighbors, once silent, now stood in solidarity with my father. The board's authority, once absolute, had been shattered in a single, public moment. As the police officer prepared to leave, my father turned to the crowd. He spoke not just for himself, but for every homeowner who had ever felt powerless. He reminded them that their homes were their sanctuaries, not the property of a handful of petty bureaucrats. He urged them to stand up for their rights, to demand accountability, to refuse to be bullied into submission. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices echoing down the street. But the board wasn't finished yet. As the crowd began to disperse, Mr. Grayson made one last desperate attempt to save face. He announced that the board would be holding an emergency meeting to review the situation and consider disciplinary action against my father. He warned that the fight was far from over, that the board would use every tool at their disposal to maintain order. My father, undaunted, simply nodded. He knew the battle wasn't finished, but for the first time, he had the support of the community behind him. The board's threats, once so terrifying, now seemed hollow. The neighbors, once divided by fear, were united by a shared sense of injustice. As the sun set over Willow Creek Estates, my father stood on the porch, surrounded by friends and allies. The board retreated to their homes, their power broken, their authority in question. The police officer, before leaving, shook my father's hand and wished him luck. The live stream, watched by hundreds, became a rallying cry for homeowners everywhere. But as night fell, a new question lingered in the air. What would the board do next? Would they accept defeat, or would they find new ways to cling to power? And would the community, now awakened, stand together to protect their rights? The battle lines had been drawn. The war for Willow Creek Estates was far from over. And as my father looked out over the quiet street, he knew one thing for certain. He was ready for whatever came next. In the days that followed the dramatic confrontation, Willow Creek Estates was transformed. The neighborhood, once ruled by whispered threats and silent compliance, now buzzed with open conversation. Neighbors who had never spoken more than a polite hello began to gather in small groups, sharing their own stories of run-ins with the HOA. The live stream of my father's standoff with the board had gone viral within the community and even reached neighboring subdivisions. For the first time, people realized they weren't alone in their frustration and fear. My father's lawsuit against the HOA became the talk of the town. The thick folder of evidence he'd handed to the police officer was now in the hands of a respected attorney who specialized in homeowner rights. The attorney, impressed by my father's meticulous documentation, agreed to take the case pro bono, seeing it as an opportunity to set a precedent for the entire region. The lawsuit alleged harassment, selective enforcement, and financial misconduct by the board, serious charges that could not be ignored. The board, once so confident in their authority, scrambled to respond. Mr. Grayson called an emergency meeting, but this time the room was packed, not just with board members, but with dozens of homeowners, many of whom had never attended before. The atmosphere was tense, but different. People were no longer afraid to speak up. My father sat near the front, flanked by neighbors who had once kept their distance, but now stood firmly by his side. At the meeting, Mr. Grayson tried to regain control. He spoke of community standards and the importance of order, but his words rang hollow. Homeowners demanded answers about the board's actions, why certain people were targeted, why fines were issued inconsistently, why the board had refused to listen to legitimate concerns. The treasurer, visibly shaken, admitted that some fines had been issued without proper documentation. The secretary, her voice trembling, confessed that she had felt pressured to go along with decisions she didn't agree with. The turning point came when the attorney representing my father stood up and addressed the room. He explained the legal ramifications of the board's actions, outlining the potential consequences for harassment and abuse of power. He reminded everyone that the HOA existed to serve the community, not to rule over it. The room fell silent as he described the next steps in the lawsuit: depositions, discovery, and the possibility of a court-ordered audit of the HOA's finances. Faced with mounting pressure, several board members resigned on the spot. The treasurer and secretary, unable to face the community's anger, stepped down and apologized publicly for their roles in the harassment. Mr. Grayson, his authority crumbling, tried to hold on, but the homeowners voted overwhelmingly to remove him as president. For the first time in years, the board was forced to hold open elections, allowing every homeowner a voice in who would represent them. My father didn't run for the board. He had no interest in wielding power over his neighbors, but he did help organize a new committee dedicated to transparency and fairness. The committee's first act was to review every outstanding fine and violation, dismissing those that had been issued unfairly or without proper evidence. They also established clear guidelines for enforcement, ensuring that no one could be targeted for personal reasons again. The lawsuit moved forward, but with the new board in place, a settlement was reached before it ever went to trial. The HOA agreed to pay my father's legal fees, issue a public apology, and implement a series of reforms designed to protect homeowners from future abuse. The state's HOA Oversight Board launched its own investigation, uncovering a pattern of misconduct that extended beyond Willow Creek Estates. Several former board members faced fines and were barred from serving on any HOA in the state for a period of years. But the impact of my father's stand went far beyond legal victories and policy changes. The neighborhood itself began to heal. People who had once lived in fear of the board's wrath now felt empowered to speak up and participate in community life. Block parties returned, children played freely in the streets, and neighbors looked out for one another. The sense of isolation and suspicion that had once defined Willow Creek Estates was replaced by a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. My father, once seen as a troublemaker, became something of a local hero. People stopped him on his morning walks to thank him for standing up for what was right. Some shared their own stories of battles with HOAs, grateful to know that change was possible. Others simply offered a smile or a wave, small gestures that meant more than words ever could. For our family, the ordeal left scars, but also a deep sense of pride. My mother, who had once worried that the fight would tear us apart, found herself surrounded by new friends and allies. She joined the neighborhood garden club, planting flowers not just for beauty, but as a symbol of resilience. I learned the value of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, and the importance of community in the face of adversity. The story of Willow Creek Estates spread beyond our little corner of the world. Local news stations covered the lawsuit, and my father was invited to speak at homeowner rights seminars. Other neighborhoods reached out, asking for advice on how to reform their own HOAs. The message was clear: no one should have to live in fear of those who are supposed to serve them. But perhaps the most lasting impact was the change in mindset. People realized that power, when unchecked, can corrupt even the most well-intentioned organizations. They learn that rules are meant to protect, not to punish, and that true community is built on trust, not fear. The new board, mindful of the past, made transparency and accountability their guiding principles. They published meeting minutes, welcomed homeowner input, and treated every resident with respect. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were still disagreements, still the occasional dispute over a fence or a flower pot. But now those conflicts were handled openly and fairly, with everyone given a chance to be heard. The days of secret fines and midnight patrols were over. Looking back, it's hard to believe how close we came to losing everything: our home, our peace of mind, our sense of belonging. But in the end, the struggle brought us closer together, not just as a family, but as a community. We learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to stand up in spite of it. We discovered that even the smallest voice can make a difference, and that real change starts with ordinary people refusing to be silenced. As for my father, he never saw himself as a hero. He was just a man who believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. But to us, and to so many others, he proved that one person's determination can break the grip of even the most entrenched power. He showed that when you fight for your home, you're really fighting for your dignity, your freedom, and your right to live without fear. So, if you ever find yourself facing an unfair HOA, a petty neighbor, or anyone who tries to use rules as a weapon, remember this story. Remember that you're not alone, and that you have the power to stand up, speak out, and demand justice. Change is possible, but it starts with you. And as the sun sets over Willow Creek Estates, the neighborhood is quieter now, but stronger than ever. The roses along our fence bloom brighter each year, a living reminder that even after the harshest winter, spring always comes. What would you do if someone tried to take away your peace, your home, your sense of belonging? Would you stand up, even if you had to stand alone? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your one subscribe means the world to us and helps us bring more real stories of courage and community to light. Because sometimes the fight for home is the fight that changes everything.